Hello everybody, this is International Master Arthur Shen, here to present the aggressive part of our repertoire against e4 and d4. So, we're going to be looking at the Najdorf defense and the Grunfeld defense. So, both these openings are extremely sharp. I play them myself personally, and I've had great success with them. I am naturally an aggressive player. I like tactics, I like attacking, so this area is really my forte, and I love playing the Najdorf. It's possibly my favorite opening of all time. And I love playing the Grunfeld. I've won many games with the black pieces in these lines. And what's great about them is, of course, you're going to have to memorize some opening theory. They are very sharp. But you can also play them through understanding. And if you understand these sharp positions and you understand the pawn structures that are produced, you'll always be able to make your way through the complications. So I look forward to presenting this material, and I think you'll enjoy it because the positions are extremely interesting, and of course they offer you great chances to play for a win. Hello everybody, we're going to start looking at the Najdorf variation against 1e4. So white has a bunch of sidelines. For instance, he can play c3, the Alpin Sicilian, he can play knight c3, which can become either the Grand Prix attack after 3f4, or the close Sicilian after 3g3. And of course, he can play another sideline like bishop b5 check, which is very popular these days, so it pays to know what to do. And against all these sidelines, I offer dynamic options that lead to sharp positions, and of course, they're sound as well. So black is not going to be worse against any of these moves. Of course, the main line is 3d4, which is the open Sicilian, and a lot of players are more comfortable facing the open Sicilian because they're more familiar with the positions, they've analyzed them more. But I feel that you'll be equally prepared against the sidelines, such as bishop b5 check and c3, as you are against the open Sicilian after you watch these videos. And I think that you'll be very confident when you play the move 1c5. Of course, the critical test is 3d4, and I think I give you all my preparation. I've used this preparation in games. Some of it I haven't had the chance to use. I have some novelties prepared, and I'm very excited to share them with you. So, just a quick rundown of black's plans. Black has sacrificed some development. White is ahead in development in return for better central control and this open c-file. So, black will move this bishop, move this knight, and bring this rook over if he wants to, getting good pressure on the c-file. And of course, he can play in the center as the arrows dictate with e6 and d5, and of course you can expand on the queen side with b5. So these are the general plans for black. For white, white has slightly more space in the center at the moment, and he is better developed. So what white is going to do is he's probably going to try to create an attack on black, most likely on the king side. So these are the general plans. The way I feel about this is if black knows what he's doing and he's familiar with his plans and he's familiar with white's plans and how to counteract those, he should be very confident. In fact, whenever I get the open Sicilian position on the board, I feel as though it's a forced win for me because I just like these positions so much and I have such a good understanding of them that I feel like no matter who my opponent is, I'm going to get a good position. And after you watch these videos, you'll feel the same way. So let's get started. So we're going to start by taking a look at some of white's sidelines. So this 2b3 move has recently had a surge in popularity. Some players as white, such as Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, have tried it with good success, but I think I found the antidote to this. Of course, black should be fine after normal moves such as knight c6 or e6. Of course, black is fine there. But I think that the best move is pawn to g6. So this looks a little strange because white can immediately play bishop b2 and attack this long diagonal. However, after knight f6, black is going to play bishop g7 and challenge this bishop, and if he gets that, then he should have absolutely no problems because this strong bishop, which usually exerts so much pressure down on the king side, has been effectively neutralized by your bishop on g7. So if you can get the move bishop to g7 in with no consequences, black has absolutely no problems. However, white can play the move e5 here to try to create some problems for you. He can also play the move queen to f3, which is also an option. And of course, you can play the move bishop takes f6, trying to ruin your pawn structure. So we'll take a look at all three of those. So let's start with bishop takes f6. I feel like this is not threatening at all because even though black's pawn structure is a little bit ruined, white has given up the pride and joy of his position, the bishop on g2, and I think that after doing so, there's really no way for white to try to play for an advantage. So after knight to c3, bishop g7, normal developing moves. We play bishop to c4, pawn to d6. Let's say knight to e2, castles, knight to g3 to prevent pawn to f5. So this is basically white's whole idea. He really wants to try to take advantage of this weakness on d5 and prevent black from opening up his bishop with the move f6, f5. However, this doesn't really work out because, among other things, black has several good moves here, but I like h5 the most. I think that this is the best way to play. We're simply threatening the move pawn to h4, which will drive the knight away, and then we're going to play f5, and this bishop on g7 is going to be a monster. And really, there's no good way for white to prevent this, because if he plays the move pawn to h4, of course this is very weakening. So we can consider a move like f5 to attack this pawn, but even better, I feel, is knight d4 first. So we're preparing f5. This move cannot be stopped, and I believe that black is already better. Absolutely no problems for black in this line after bishop takes f6. Queen f3 is a little trickier, but black has several different moves here that offer a good position. I think that bishop g7 should be absolutely fine for black, but I feel like knight c6 leads to some pretty fun positions. So this is the move I'm going to recommend. After e5, we're going to play the move knight to h5. So it looks like our knight is a little silly on h5, but the problem is white's center is just simply not going to hold together. This pawn on e5 is not sustainable. It's gonna drop very soon, and after the pawn drops, really black's pieces are much better placed than the white counterparts. So if a move like e6, we simply play f6, and while this looks very weakening, in reality, there's absolutely no problem for black here because white is going to have to take here, and then we simply recapture, and here black is already better. He just has great central control after he plays the move pawn to e5. This knight in h5 can of course come back into the game through f4 or g7, and really, even though it looks like there's some holes around the black king, how is white going to take advantage of those? His pieces are all on the back rank, doing absolutely nothing. Black has great central control, great lead in development. Black is already better. So that's nothing to worry about. Bishop c4 is sort of a one-move threat, threatening checkmate, a little tricky, but black should have absolutely no problems after e6. And after, let's say, knight to e2, we can just complete our development with bishop g7, and we're not worried about pawn to g4 because there's this nice trick, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, attacking the rook on a1. So there's this knight on g4. Knight on h5 will not get trapped by pawn to g4. And if white protects his pawn with queen to e3, we simply play d5, taking advantage of this pin, so white cannot take en passant, and already here black is better. Just continuing with this line, bishop b5, d4, absolutely no problems for black. Takes, queen e4, and queen d5. I think white's position is pretty terrible. As we can see, he's going to be losing a pawn, and I don't really see enough compensation for it. This pawn on e5 is not going to be sustainable. Queen takes d5, e takes d5 is very important to prevent g4, and eventually this pawn is going to be lost. So that leads us to 4e5, which is the main line. Really, this doesn't offer black any challenges. Knight h5 is possible as well, but to me it doesn't really make sense to not play the move knight to d5. I mean, if you could put your knight in the center, why would you put it on h5? So e6 I feel like is the scariest looking move because it looks like black is going to have to make some concessions. But in reality, if we think about it, white has played the move e4, e5, e6, and after f6, he's going to have to trade this pawn. So he spent 3 moves to just trade this pawn. Really, I don't see how white can have any advantage after this. Black is ahead in development and should have a very good position after any capture, but I believe queen takes c7 is the most natural. And after knight c3, queen e6 check, queen e2, we can simply exchange. And after knight c6, black has a lead in development, better control over the center. I feel like I would rather be black than white in this position. So there are really no other ways for white to challenge black's setup. You can take a look at the accompanying file, and I feel like you'll be very confident if white tries to surprise you with this move. 2b3, 2g6 is an excellent antidote. It leads to very sharp positions, and of course white can end up worse very quickly. So nothing to worry about there. Let's take a look at a slightly more serious sideline, which is the closed Sicilian after knight to c3. This is also nothing to worry about. So we're going to play the move pawn to d6, just so that if white tries to transpose into the Najdorf, or the open Sicilian again, we can always get our Najdorf after a6. So we don't want to play a move, for instance, like knight c6, because after knight to f3, if white gets d4 in, we're going to have to play a whole different Sicilian, and that's not what we want. So move order is a little important. We want to play d6. So after g3, which is the closed Sicilian, we'll be taking a look at f4, the Grand Prix, in its own video, because this is a very popular line, especially at the club level. A lot of kids are taught to play, f4 and just create an attack very quickly. And white's plans are very simple, so it's very easy to play as white. But I think I provided a very good antidote to that. You'll see that in the Grand Prix video, and black has absolutely no problems and can of course play for a win. So we're going to take a look at g3, which is the closed Sicilian. We're going to play g6. Now here, white can try to be a little clever with his move order and play pawn to d3 before playing bishop to g2. The idea is after bishop g7, bishop e3, white hasn't had to quote-unquote waste the move with bishop g2, so black's idea, as we'll see in the main line of playing knight f6, isn't as effective here. However, this is nothing to really worry about. We can simply play knight to c6, queen to d2. So white's idea is as soon as this knight on g8 moves, white is going to trade off the strong bishop on g7 with bishop to h6, and this can be a little problematic. However, the cleverest way to deal with this is to simply not play knight f6 right away. We're going to delay the development of the kingside pieces, and we're going to play rook b8. Continue with our idea of expanding on the queen side. So we're going to play b5, next move, b4, and let's say bishop g2, we'll play b5, and after knight to e2, we can play, let's say, b4, this knight has to drop back, and now we can continue with a5, or we can play knight f6. Really the idea is, the idea here is to delay the development of this knight, because white's whole idea is to play the move bishop to h6. So for instance, let's look at this. And if we castle, he's going to start a quick attack with h4. So this can get very, very scary. However, if white has to delay playing bishop h6 because his knight is on g8, we're just going to simply improve our position. As we notice, the moves that white has gotten in bishop g2, knight to e2 aren't as effective for his h4, h5 plan as black's moves have been for his queenside counterplay. So let's say a5 here. Really, white doesn't have a good way of getting this move bishop to h6 in. So that's if white tries this very clever move order finesse for d3. However, the main line, of course, is bishop to g2, bishop to g7, d3, d3, knight c6, apologize, and after bishop e3, of course, black can play the same way with rook to b8. Well, however, I like the move knight to f6 here. I think it's just as viable, and really the point is knight to g4 is threatened. So if a move like queen to c1, we hop our knight into g4. Now, if white lets us exchange this knight for this bishop, it's going to be very good for black, because black has this very, very strong bishop on g7 that can never be contested. black is absolutely fine here, and if white lets me take this bishop off, I think black has a better position. So bishop to d2 is mandatory, and here we can just simply castle. h3, knight f6, bishop h6. This attack is not scary at all because we're going to take, and we're going to start our quick queenside counterplay with queen to b6. And if castles, this move c4 is very strong, attacking this f2 pawn. Black has great play in the center, and I would actually prefer black in this position. Of course, if this isn't to your taste, we can continue. You can continue with the same plan as before, with the move rook to b8, as mentioned before. Okay, so that wraps up the b3 Sicilian and the closed Sicilian, two lines which I feel are not dangerous at all if black is well prepared. So a lot of players don't like it when their opponents avoid the open Sicilian, but I feel like, having seen this preparation from me, you should have no fear of the closed Sicilian, and in fact, you should feel like I do. I should be happy. You should be happy to see these sidelines because you know white is not challenging you at all. So now we're going to take a look at the Grand Prix attack, which is one of white's most popular sidelines. I don't think it's very good, but the reason it's so popular is it's very easy for white to play. White will follow pretty much the same plan every game, and that's very appealing to a lot of players because you don't have to study any opening theory. However, if black knows what he's doing and he's familiar with the correct plans, black has absolutely no problems in this position. So I'm going to recommend the move 3 knight c6, knight to f3, and then pawn to g6. So it's important to note that after d4 transposing into the open Sicilian, black is almost always going to be okay here. After d4 takes, we're going to play the move bishop to g7, developing our bishop to the strong diagonal. After bishop e3, we'll play knight to f6, threatening knight to g4. And black has absolutely no problems here. He can consider playing the move e5 very shortly, fighting for control over the center. And really, white's setup is not ideal to deal with the dragon. Even though we're not dragon players, this position is not really a dragon because white would like his pawn on f3 to support g4, h4, and attack on the queen side, on the king side. But white simply does not have time for this in this position. His center has been too weakened by playing f4 and e4, and black is 100% okay here. So, knowing that white does not want to enter open Sicilian territory is important, and knowing that he can't do that allows us to play this move g6 and get our ideal setup against the Grand Prix. So, there is this move bishop to b5 here, as opposed to the normal mainline bishop to c4. Bishop b5 I don't think is very threatening. It's important to know to play the move bishop to d7 here, so that after bishop takes c6 we can recapture with the bishop. And after castles, bishop g7, there are absolutely no problems here at all. So moving on to the main line, bishop to c4, here I'm going to recommend a very nice plan. So first we're going to complete our development with bishop g7, castles, we'll play e6, white will play d3 probably to develop his pieces, knight g7, queen to e1. So this is sort of the plan of white. White is going to play queen e1, queen h4, f5, and create an attack on the black king. Now let me show you what not to do. So what you don't want to do here is basically play into white's plan. Let's say you castle, then he plays queen h4. Let's say you play a6 to play on the queen side, then he plays f5. And this position is going to get very, very dangerous for black very quickly. For instance, if you take bishop to h6, and again, white's attack is extremely powerful, knight to g5 is coming, and for instance, after d takes d4, knight to g5, I believe that white is already winning. So this position can get very dangerous for you very quickly if you allow white to get what he wants. So how do we prevent white from getting what he wants? Well, very simple. We simply don't castle. So I like the move pawn to h6. I think this is the strongest move, and the idea is we're going to delay castling, and this move h6 is actually very useful because if you delay castling, white can often consider playing the move f5 anyway. But here, this move isn't good at all because the knight and the bishop both cannot come to g5 anymore, and this really blunts white's attack. So after f5, for instance here, this is a very dubious move in my position, in my opinion, in this position. You can simply take this pawn and be up a pawn pretty much. If e takes f5, knight takes f5, of course, black has great central control. He's going to hop his knight into d4 pretty soon. Most likely castle queenside, but castling kingside is also possible, of course. The king is not in so much danger with such good central control from the black pieces. Black is 100% fine here. In fact, black is simply up a pawn for no compensation, probably close to winning. Knight h4 is a little cleverer, better attempt to try to play this position, but after d takes e4, d takes e4, and several moves here, I feel like knight e5 is the most natural. Bishop e2, and let's say bishop d7. Black will castle queenside, and again is up a pretty healthy pawn for not very much compensation. So, immediate attempts to checkmate black are very unsuccessful after h6, and really here, it's telling that the most popular move here for white is bishop to b3. It just goes to show that white doesn't really have a good way of improving his position. And again here, we can continue with the same plan of delaying castling. We can play the move pawn to a6, which is part of our plan to play on the queen side. And after a4, we'll play the move rook to b8. b5 is coming next. White's position really doesn't make any sense if black hasn't committed to castling. And of course, f5 is again ineffective because we can simply capture this pawn. So, in my opinion, black is doing 100% okay after this very clever move, pawn to h6. So this wraps up our coverage of the Grand Prix attack. I think it's really important to dedicate a whole video to this variation because I know that when I was younger and starting out playing the Najdorf, I would hate seeing the Grand Prix attack because I just didn't know how to combat it. And once I finally figured out that you can play the move h6 and just delay castling, my life became so much easier. So I think that as long as you know what to do against the Grand Prix, you'll be 100% okay. Now we're going to take a look at the Sicilian variations where white plays c3, either on move 2 or after knight f3 d6, c3. So these options are both very popular, and it pays to know what to do. So let's start with 2 knight f3 d6, c3. Here we're going to play the move knight to f6, not really attacking this pawn. It's important to know that, for instance, after the move bishop e2 or the move h3, you can't take this pawn because of queen a4 check. Don't fall into this trap. A lot of strong players have actually taken this pawn and simply been down a piece on move 5. Not what you want to do. So the main line after knight f6 is bishop e2. So of course we do not capture this pawn. Instead we play the move pawn to g6. This pawn, this bishop on g7 is going to be a very strong piece, exerting a lot of control over the center. So we definitely want to put our bishop on the best square we can. So after castles, bishop g7, of course it pays to know that d4 is not possible because now we can take this pawn, because queen a4 check no longer attacks our knight. So white cannot immediately seize control over the center. Important to know that. g6, castles, bishop g7. Here bishop b5 check has recently become popular. If white continues normally, after rook e1, castles, bishop f1 for instance, here, black has lots of good moves. Personally, I like the move pawn to e5, just seizing control over the center. d4 is never going to be good because I have this really strong bishop on g7, so if you play d4, my bishop is just going to be an absolute monster. And if you don't play d4, I'm going to complete my development. I'm going to play knight c6, rook e8, and then play d5. And if I get those moves in, I'm going to use a different color arrow, so the different plans become clear. If I get that in, black is just going to have a better position. He's going to have more space in the center, better central control as a result, and a better position. So really, white is caught in between a rock and a hard place here. And if he plays d4, because I really don't see another way for white to continue, we just takes, and knight takes d4. And here, very strong, is just opening up the center with d5, and black has absolutely no problems here. In fact, I would rather be black. His bishop on d7, as we said before, is a bit of a monster. So that's why white players have turned to playing the move bishop b5 check, but this is not really scary either. It's a very rare idea, by the way, so don't be surprised if your opponent doesn't know this. But this is the critical test, in my opinion. I believe that after knight c6, black has absolutely no problems. Here, d4 is the only move that really makes sense, because if you don't play d4, what else are you going to really do in this position as white? This move pretty much has to be played. And after castles, we are threatening now to take this pawn on e4. So white has to do something about that. He can play d5 here, and now pretty much any knight move offers black equality. Knight e5, knight b8 even, and knight a5. I'm recommending knight a5 just because we're going to start playing on the queen side, and this knight here, even though it doesn't look so good right now, eventually it will be a very useful piece. It could hop into c4 in the future, or after playing c4 yourself and b5, this knight can reroute itself to the very strong c5 square. So, actually let me change again the colors of the arrow so that we know which plan is which. And black has absolutely no problems here. He is going to challenge the center with pawn to e6, and again, his position is very easy to play. We're simply going to start expanding on the queen side, and of course now that d4, d5 has been played, this bishop, again, is a monster. So it's very important to put this bishop on g7. As we've seen, it's going to be very strong. So that's what to do against bishop e2, which is arguably the most popular move. Recently, bishop d3 has superseded bishop e2 in popularity. So let's take a look at that move. Here, I think the best move is simple development. Knight to c6, bishop to c2, and now that there's no bishop on e2 to block the diagonal, I like the move bishop to g4. The bishop is very well placed here, and let's say castles, e6. So white can always throw the move h3 in. Of course, that's possible. But here, it's even possible for black to play queen c7 and castle queenside after h3 has been played, because there's a little hook here, and we're just going to play rook g8, g5, g4 after we've castled, and black actually gets a very, very strong attack. For more reference on how to handle this position, there's a model game, I think, on what to do if white plays h3, and that's the game Shabalov against Shankland from the World Open. Shankland, of course, is now a very, very strong player. Back then, he was not even an IM, I believe, so he was not as strong back then, but of course, still a very talented player, played a very, very good game, model game, and I think that that's a great way to handle this position. So, if white doesn't castle and, doesn't play h3, it's not really clear how he's supposed to get rid of this pin. So, let's say he plays d3, we'll play bishop e7, h3, bishop h5, queen c7, rook e1, queen c7, doing all our development. And now if white basically has to try to expand to the center with pawn to d4, otherwise black is just going to castle queenside and play g5 and get a very strong attack. And here, we're just going to take on f3. Now, of course, queen takes f3 runs into some tactical problems after knight takes d4. So white is forced to ruin the structure, and after pawn to e5, I see absolutely no problems for black. White's king is permanently exposed, and black is going to have great control over the dark squares. A common idea is even to play the move bishop d8, bishop to b6, to get this bishop out. And as long as you know that idea, we're going to play on the c file with rook c8. Black has great control over the center. I feel like black is almost better in this position. So that's the move bishop to d3. There is a sideline pawn to h3, which for some reason I can't really fathom why has become slightly popular. To me, it doesn't really make much sense. Bishop g4 is not a threat right away, so why are you playing h3? I feel like knight c6 is the best way to handle this. And in this position, a lot of players play the move bishop to d3. In this position, of course, you can play the move pawn to g6 and have no problems, but I like the move pawn to d5. It's very sharp. e5, knight e7. I think black is actually better here. Just simply has a better position. I'll just give you the main line. Of course, this position has been analyzed more in depth in the file that will accompany these videos. So, of course, take a look at that if you're unsure of what to do. But in reality, we can simply look at this position and we see that White has overextended himself with the move e5. And after queen to c7, e6, really the only way for White to continue, we can simply take this pawn. And though it looks like we might have weakened our king position, in reality, White's development is so horrible because his bishop on d3 stops his bishop on c1 from developing, and this knight on b1 can't really get into the game. Simply put, White is playing with half his pieces, so there's really no way that Black's king can be in any danger. Knight g5 is the critical test, and after knight e5, bishop takes h7. We simply play g6, try to trap this guy. f4, bishop h6. So this is obviously a computer-generated line. I won't deny it. After h4, we takes, and we play king f8. Takes, king g7. And in fact here, Black does have a better position simply because White cannot develop his pieces. And of course this e5 pawn is quite weak. So to protect this, he has to play d4, sacrificing a pawn. Takes, say castles. And after bishop d7, the position is wild, of course, but as an out of play, you should have no fear of these sort of positions. And in fact, Black does have a better position here, so there's really nothing to fear. Of course, there are some sidelines or some different variations that White can try, but the conclusion is that, in fact, after d5, I believe Black has a better position. So that covers the delayed Alapin after 2 knight f3, d6, c3. Let's look at the mainline Alapin. So I'm going to recommend the move knight to f6. Now, just a side note, if your opponent plays a Smith-Morra, d4, c takes d4, c3, of course accepting the gambit is perfectly fine, but that's a little scary, and really you have to memorize theory, which is not really what I would want to do as a Black player. It's such a rare line, and I just feel like there's no need to devote some of my memory to something that's almost never played. So I like to transpose back into the Alapin with knight f6. And really White here has nothing better than playing e5, knight d5. And we'll reach a position, we'll reach the Alapin position from this move order. So here e5, and now with d4 we can take, and this is the Smith-Morra position. So on that note, let's take a look at let's take a look at what to do in these positions. So let's take a look at the Smith-Morra move order position that we can get. So here White can play the move knight f3, or queen takes d4. C takes d4 will most likely transpose into lines that we'll examine from a different move order, so let's not worry about that right now. Knight f3, here we're just going to play e6, and if White doesn't play queen takes d4, he really is going to transpose back into the main lines at c takes d4. So let's look at queen takes d4. This is absolutely nothing to worry about. We'll just play e6, we'll just play knight c6, attacking the queen. And after queen e4, because White wants to keep an eye on this e5 pawn, we'll just play the move pawn to f5. And here, Black has absolutely no problems. This pawn on e5 is not easily protected, and we're just going to complete our development either with g6, bishop g7, or simple chess, just bishop e7 and castles. We can always challenge the center with pawn to d6. There's really absolutely nothing to worry about here for Black. And after c4, we'll play knight e7, and this knight will reroute itself to the g6 square. So let's take a look at the main lines. So instead of d4, more often than not, knight f3 is played, e6, bishop c4, and we're just going to play pawn to d6, challenging the center. And here, really, White has to play the move pawn to d4. So we'll take. By the way, it's important to note that this position is never anything to worry about. Black simply has the two bishops here for very little compensation. So d4, c takes d4, and here again takes, absolutely nothing to worry about. Or queen takes. This isolated pawn is not very weak. It's very difficult for white to attack it. Black has absolutely no problems. So c takes c4 is the main line, of course. And now we drop our knight back to b6. Now here it's important to know that bishop b3 is a big mistake for white, because after d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d1, this endgame structure is always good for black, because this pawn on e5 is simply very weak, and the only justification for having this pawn on e5 is if you're going to get a kingside attack. But with the queens off, obviously black is not going to get checkmated. Already here, even though the computer won't tell you it, black has a better position. There's simply a weakness on e5 that black can easily target. So it is important to know that that white does not want to trade queens, and he'll play the move bishop to d3. We'll take. Now, if knight takes e5, it is important to know that after knight c6, these pawn structures are always good for black, because pawn to c5 will come and will trade off my weak pawn on c6 for the weak pawn on d4. Bishop will come to b7, and absolutely no problems for black. So, bishop d3 takes. Pawn takes is really the only way for white to try to get an attack on your king. And here I'm going to recommend the very offbeat move, knight to d7. The same position can often also be reached after knight to a6. The idea is we're going to hop the knight into c5. But knight d7 is a more normal looking move, so I'm going to recommend that instead. Now here, another pitfall for white. If white plays a very natural looking castles, after knight to c5, bishop c2 takes, we get a very similar position to the one we discussed after 8, bishop b3. And it's the same idea. In the endgame, this structure is not good for white. This pawn in e5 is simply a weakness, and there's no good way for white to justify trading queens. So the best move is queen to e2. So this is, if white gets here, he's probably already a strong player, because he's familiar with the structure, he has a good understanding of the position, and he knows that he cannot allow black to trade queens. So here we continue with our plan. Knight to c5, bishop to c2, and knight to d5. So black has these very strong knights in the center, and really it's on white to try to attack the black king after we castle kingside. So castles, and here I like to move bishop to d7. So the whole idea is we're going to solidify our center with bishop to c6. All our pieces are on great squares after bishop e7 castles, and black's position is very solid, and of course white always has this weakness on e5. So let's say rook to d1. We'll play bishop to e7. Now, after knight to d2, which is the main line in my opinion, black castles, and really black has absolutely no problems here. He's going to play the move rook to c8, queen c7, or queen a5, or queen b6. It doesn't really matter. Just get the queen out, move the rook to d8, and start playing on the queen side, let's say with b5. And really, there's no way for white to get at the black king. He has these 4 very solid pawns in front of his king, and these 2 beautiful knights in the center, keeping all of white's pieces out. For instance, queen e4 and queen d3 are simply impossible because of this knight on c5. Queen e3 is also impossible because of the knight on d5. Really, it's going to be very, very difficult for white to get any sort of attack on the black king. In my opinion, knight c3 is a little trickier to deal with instead of knight d2, but I believe that black has no problems after takes, and let's say queen c7, getting out of the pin. And what we're going to do is we're just going to castle next, play bishop c6, play rook d8, play rook d8 after castling, play rook c8. There's just weak pawn on c3. Black should have nothing to worry about here. So this concludes our analysis of the Alapin Sicilian. Again, let's recap what happens after 2 knight f3, d6 c3, the delayed Alapin. we play knight f6, and after bishop e2, we play g6, getting our bishop out. And if bishop to d3 instead of bishop e2, we play knight c6, bishop c2, and then we take advantage of the fact that this bishop can no longer block this pin on e2, and we bring our bishop out to g4. And after h3, which I think is a little silly, we simply play knight c6, and then d5. And black has absolutely no problems here. And in the mainline Alpine Sicilian, which can be reached through the Smith-Morra move order, it's important to know that the structure that we're going to get, this mainline structure, after d6, bishop c4, knight b6, and then taking on e5, pretty much any queen trade, or any trade in general, is going to be good for black, because what white wants to do is white wants to attack the black king. Of course, any trades are going to help black, and a lot of players will play the natural move, castles, and immediately after knight c5, black has an extremely comfortable game. So I don't think there's anything to fear in these Alpin lines, and I think if you're well prepared, you can definitely surprise your opponent and get a good position at the same time. Now we're going to take a look at the sideline for queen takes d4. So d4, c takes d4, and queen takes d4. So the best way to meet this is knight to c6, attacking the queen, and here really the only move that makes sense is bishop to b5. After bishop to d7, blocking the pin and renewing the attack on the queen, bishop takes c6 is the most natural way of playing. Queen d3 is also possible, but here after g6, c4, bishop g7, we'll get a similar position in the 3 bishop b5 check line that we'll take a look at later, but it pays to know that this Maroczy position is absolutely not threatening at all for black. Usually in these positions, white will have his bishop on b5 much better placed on e2, where the bishop on b5 simply is just a target after a6. And white will have this knight on d4, and the bishop on e3 will not have had to waste time with queen d4, queen d3. So this is just a very bad Maroczy bind position for white. And indeed, after, let's say, knight to c3, knight to f6, black has absolutely no problems. Most likely, after castles h3 to prevent knight g4 after bishop e3, because after bishop e3, knight g4 is quite unpleasant for white to deal with. Let's say h3, even more time is being wasted, and after, let's say, a6, takes, black has a variety of plans. You can play for b5, or black can play knight d7, knight c5, or knight d7, knight e5. Just a plethora of plans for black. Really, absolutely nothing to worry about. An extremely easy position to play. So this is the reason why bishop takes c6 is pretty much always played. White wants to keep his queen on d4, and he's trying to argue that the queen is well placed there. In my opinion, it isn't, so I don't think that black has anything to worry about. Bishop takes c6, knight to c3. Again, white can try to get a Maroczy position, but it's going to be very similar to the line that we looked at with queen d3 immediately instead of very similar to this line, queen d3 immediately instead of bishop takes c6 and then c4. Really, knight to f6, g6, bishop g7, castles. This queen is going to have to move back, and we can continue with our plan of either playing a6, b5, or we can play knight d7 and then knight c5. Knight d7 and then knight c5. So really nothing to worry about if white tries to get the Maroczy bind in. Knight c3 is the main line, knight to f6, and white plays a move bishop to g5, trying to get quick development in. Pawn to e6 and castles queenside. Here bishop e7 is the best move, not fearing bishop takes f6, because after bishop takes f6, we can simply play bishop takes f6, and after, if white tries to win a pawn, oops, he doesn't, we get the pawn back with a much better endgame. Bishop versus knight on an open board, and of course, these really ugly pawns. So, bishop e7, there's nothing to worry about white trying to win a pawn here. The main line here is rook e1. White can also try some moves like king b1, or queen d3, but really they don't really change the nature of the position. After queen d3, in fact, I like to move queen to a5, simply developing my queen. And after a move like h4, we can simply drive this bishop away with h6. And after bishop d2, we can play this move queen to a6. It's a very clever move. The idea is, after takes, it looks like we've given ourselves these really ugly pawns for no reason. But in fact, the rook will come to b8, bearing down on the b file. The other rook, after I castle, will come to c8, bearing down on the c file. Black has good pressure on the white center and the two bishops on a reasonably open board. And again, these pawns are not really weaknesses because, come on, how is white going to attack them? You know, there's no way for the white pieces to attack these pawns. Absolutely no problems for black here. This is a very nice idea to know. You can play the move queen to a6 in these positions and trade off the queens, even though your pawn structure might get a little ruined. So that's if queen d3. King b1 is also possible. I really don't think it changes the position too much. We're simply going to castle. Let's say queen d3, so the white knight can come into d4. And we'll play pretty much in the same way. We'll play h6. So now after, usually we don't want to move pawns in front of our king, but in this position, it's very difficult for white to choose a place for his bishop. If he plays h4 trying to sacrifice it, we don't want to take because then the h file will open and our king will be in some danger there. We'll just play queen a5, similar to what we've done before, and white is really stuck here. How is he supposed to continue his attack? It's really not easy at all. And if white does nothing, we're simply going to play b5, b4, rook c8, rook b8, and the black attack is coming pretty quickly. So yes, white can try to move knight to d4, but now we can take because our queen can come to g5. And this, I believe, is a forced draw by repetition. And the queen moves and then comes back. If you don't want to draw, of course, you don't have to take this bishop. You can continue normally with, let's say, rook c8, preparing to move b5. But, of course, a draw with black, never an awful result. So if white plays rook he1, the most natural move, centralizing his rook, we can play simply castles. And really, black's plan is going to be the same no matter what. He's going to move his queen either to c7 or a5. It doesn't really matter. And we're going to then play b5, b4, and get very typical Najdorf or shenanigan sort of structure counterplay on the white king. And I don't see why this is a better version of the English attack or any sort of position where kings are castled on the opposite sides of the board in the mainline Najdorf. So I'd be very happy to see this as black. Black has absolutely no problems here. So you can take a look at the file that we provided in conjunction with these videos for more detail. I think the plans are very clear for black. I don't think that this is threatening at all. This should not be something that keeps you up at night. So now we're going to move on to the open Sicilian, which is, of course, the critical test of the Najdorf. So now we're going to take a look at the very popular and very topical sideline, bishop to b5 check. So this has become the go-to way for a lot of players to avoid the Najdorf and the open Sicilian in general. And it's very popular at the top level, so definitely expect some people to pick up on this trend and play this move as well. So the main move is bishop to d7. And there are some sidelines here. White can play c4, white can play a4, none of which are very threatening. Almost invariably, white will play bishop takes d7. And here, everyone plays the move queen takes d7. It's the most popular move by far. However, I have a very interesting idea, which is knight takes d7. I like this move a lot, and it leads to some very interesting positions. So let's take a look first at the sidelines after c4. So this is not very threatening, so we can play the move knight to f6, because after bishop takes d7, we can simply transpose into our main line, so that's not anything new. If white wants to get a truly different position, he can play the move knight to c3. However, here we're just going to complete our development with knight to c6, castles, and we'll play the move, not king f1, that's a bad move. he's going to castle. We're going to play g6. And now, after d4, takes, bishop to g7. Really, the problem is white can't play bishop e3 because of knight to g4. So this is a little problematic for him. He can play the move pawn to h3. And here we can play the move knight takes e4, which will win a pawn. I think that this is the best way to play. And after bishop takes c6, d takes c6. Excuse me, bishop takes c6. I apologize. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. If knight takes c6, of course we throw in the in-between move knight takes c3, after which black has absolutely no problems. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. Let's say rook e1. We'll play the move pawn to d5. The position is very complicated, but in my opinion, black does have a slight advantage here. He is up a pawn, and I don't see full compensation for white. So it's very difficult for white to develop the rest of his pieces. He can play the move bishop takes c6 to try to play bishop e3 next. After d takes c6, c5, trying to put pressure on the black center. This really doesn't offer anything. We can take on c5, of course, but I prefer simply castling. And really, I don't see any problems for black. He's going to continue his development with queen c7, probably play rook b8. And really, black has the two bishops on an open board and good central control. I really don't see anything for black to worry about. So that's for c4. For a4 is even less popular and I think even less good. It really doesn't scare me at all. I don't see why having this pawn on a4 really does anything. And after knight to f6, we're simply going to play like we normally do. We'll play knight c6, g6, bishop to g7, and really this bishop on b5 doesn't make any sense. So a4 is not really a serious move at all. So let's go to the main line. Bishop takes d7, knight takes d7. It's a very rare idea, and I quite like this line. So white basically has two different setups. So we'll take a look at them. White can castle, and after knight f6, he can play with c4, or he can play with pawn to c3. So here the most common move is queen to e2. Rook e1 is also possible and will lead to pretty much the same thing. Queen to e2. Well, let's take a look at rook e1 first. We'll look at the whole idea. My clever idea is instead of playing normally with e6 or g6, so these are the two different ways black can set up his position. He can put his bishop on g7 or he can put his bishop on e7. But it's not clear which one he wants to do yet, and I'll explain why. So what we're going to do is we're going to play a very useful waiting move, rook to c8. So this move is always going to be useful, and we're asking white to decide his setup. So if white plays c3, here playing g6 isn't as strong because then after d4, white gets immediate control over the center, and really that's not what we want. So against c3, we want to play the move e6. And the idea is after d4 takes, we're going to play d5, and take control of the center this way. Against b3 or c4, they'll lead to the same thing. We want to play g6, because against these Maroczy setups, after pawn to d4, we really want our bishop on g7 controlling this very strong long diagonal. So just to recap, here white has two setups that he can play, and black has two setups that he can play. And against the different white setups, black wants to put his bishop on a different square, either g7 or e7. So against the Maroczy setups, for instance after c4, we want to play g6, because the bishop is going to be very well placed here. But after c3, we don't want to play g6 because after d4, our bishop really is quite limited. So instead, we play e6, and after white takes control of the center, we play pawn to d5. And here, just continuing this line, we play knight to e4, and black, of course, has absolutely no problems here. Excellent central control, and he'll complete his development very quickly. For instance, bishop b4, he'll castle, and we see why this rook c8 move is always useful. This rook on c8 is a monster piece. And in the Maroczy positions, just to continue the idea of this rook being strong. After bishop g7, excuse me, g6, let's say b3, bishop b7, d4, takes. This rook on the c-file is always very useful. So, for instance, if we continue with our plan of playing a6, b5, we see how this rook on the c-file is a great piece. So that's rook e1. Queen e2 is very similar, and I think is an improved version for white. The queen is pretty well placed on e2, and this rook can come to d1 as opposed to e1. So again, we play the move rook to c8. So, yeah, again, just to reiterate, I think this is very important. White has two plans. He can play c3 and d4, or he can play b3 and c4. Rook c8 is a useful move against both of those, so we want to choose our ideal setup based on what setup white chooses. So this is basically a waiting move that is also useful in both setups. So I think this is a very clever move, and I think it offers black a very good position. So let's take a look at c3, because I don't think it's as critical. Excuse me, I think it's more critical than the b3 lines. So let's start with b3. Here, we play g6. As discussed, we want the bishop on this long diagonal. Here, actually, it's kind of funny. Alex Ostrovsky, another chesslessons.com contributor, played this position against me, and here he switched gears and played pawn to c3. So this is a very interesting idea, basically geared against the fact that the g6 setup isn't ideal against the c3 move. Of course, this has its drawbacks. b3 is not particularly a useful move. In fact, in a lot of positions, white would rather have his pawn back on b2. So black, of course, is 100% fine here. Bishop g7, d4, takes. And here, I mean, there's several different ways of playing, but I think the simplest is just to play d5, e5, and then knight to e4. And of course, we see that white would rather have his pawn on b2, so that knight c3 would be easier to play. But the way things are right now, knight c3 is not going to happen, and black has absolutely no problems here. So, if white plays more traditionally, c3 is a very creative way to try to punish black's setup. But if he plays normally, let's say with c4, bishop g7, bishop b2, castles d4, I actually feel that black has absolutely no problems here. Takes. I actually have some very interesting analysis here. Here, a normal move like a6, of course, is perfectly fine. But I found a very interesting new idea. This novelty pawn to e6. So I think this is very strong, and of course this requires some analysis because the positions are going to get pretty sharp, as we'll see. So if you just don't want to bother memorizing these lines, I understand. You don't have to use this analysis. You can play pawn to a6 instead. The position is perfectly fine for you. But I'm an ambitious guy. I feel like I want to make the position complicated, make it sharp, and play for a win. So I really like this move, pawn to e6. Of course, the drawback is this guy on d6 is a little weakened. But of course, what we're going to do is we're just going to push d5 and get great counterplay. So if knight to c3, we can play d5 anyway, actually. And we'll regain our pawn after takes. We'll just play knight b6. Of course, we got three guys on this pawn. This poor guy is not going to make it. And we're going to have this really strong bishop on g7. And we're going to play rook e8, get a good central control. Black is 100% okay here. So really the only way for white to try to play this position is to play knight b5. Things are going to get a little crazy now. We're going to play the move pawn to d5. Now, this is really putting white on the spot, taking advantage of the fact that he really hasn't developed his queenside. This does entail a piece sacrifice, though. So, for instance, after pawn to e5, white can try to win a pawn, like this, but after rook to c5, there really isn't anything to worry about. This knight is pretty misplaced. After knight b5, we're just going to take on c4, takes, and we can play rook e8, queen c2, let's say, and let's say knight e5. I think it's very clear to see that black has more than enough compensation in this position. Just look at the white pieces, and look at white's extra pawn. It's this guy on c4, very, very weak. And in the meantime, all black's pieces are on their perfect squares. This rook can swing over to the queen side. This bishop's a monster. These knights are perfectly centralized. The rook is very well centralized. The queen is in the center. Everything is perfect here. I think black is already better. So, white really has to pick up the gauntlet and play the move pawn to e5. But gets very exciting after knight to h5. Knight to f4 is currently threatened. So white needs to stop that with f4. And here it looks like, well, my knight is kind of silly on h5. It's probably going to get trapped pretty soon, right? Well, not so quick. So first we take on c4. Now, knight d6 is the most natural move, and pretty much the only move. Otherwise, white is just going to have to take back and have this really weak guy on c4 for no reason. So, if he plays knight d6, we can throw in this nice in-between move, pawn to c3. So the idea is, if knight takes c3, which looks like the most natural move, we hit him with knight takes f4. Really, really strong. Of course, this line is computer generated. It's not like I came up with this myself. I can't brag. This is computer generated, but the idea of e6 isn't. So this will definitely catch your opponents unaware. The computer doesn't recommend e6. And once you find this idea of playing e6, d5, and if you get this position in the game, I'm pretty sure it's almost a forced win for you, because this position is really, really difficult for white to play. And after rook takes f4, bishop takes d5. White can barely equalize with this very inhuman move. Rook takes f7, rook takes f7, knight takes f7, king takes f7. The computer says that white is maybe only a little bit worse here. Black is up a pawn, but his king position is slightly weakened, and his coordination that was so beautiful a few moves ago was a little bit ruined. This knight on d7 isn't ideal, but black has a very good position here, of course, anyway. He is up a pawn, as we've noted before. So instead of knight takes c3, white does have some other options, such as bishop takes c3. Here now knight takes c5, of course, is impossible because e5 is protected by the bishop. So we'll play rook to c6 instead. And here, of course, the whole idea of white is to play the move g4, trapping the piece. But after knight takes f4, rook takes f4, queen g5, very important in-between move. I believe black has more than enough compensation for the pawn. After rook e4, we play the really strong move f5. Everything is just pouring onto white. Really, this onslaught is very, very difficult to deal with. And I believe that white has to play a series of only computer moves to just not simply be worse. And even if he plays everything perfectly, the position is still equal. So I believe the best line is rook c4. I think this is the only move. After rook takes c4, knight takes c4, we'll play the move pawn to b5, and then rook to c8. White cannot develop any of his forces. Black is going to win back at least one pawn, probably two. He'll have two or three pawns for the piece, and of course the white king is horribly exposed. None of white's pieces on the queen side have been developed. Black is, I think, actually close to being simply better, and of course you can analyze the position more in depth. I'm not saying my analysis is perfect here, but I'm saying objectively in this position, white should have a very, very hard time playing because black's play is so easy, simply attacking the white king, attacking the weak pawns, forcing white's pieces back, and in the meantime, white has to play extremely accurately not to just lose on the spot. So that's the line with pawn to b3, and I think my exciting novelty, e6, will really be a lot of fun for you guys to play. Of course, if you just don't want to look at these lines and don't want to memorize them, I understand. a6, of course, is 100% okay. So, how about we take a look at c3, which is the other setup that white can implement. And I also have a very interesting idea here. Pawn to e6, of course, as we mentioned before. This is the way we want to play. Takes, d5, and after e5, knight e4, of course, should be okay. Black should be fine in these positions, but they can get a little bit unpleasant. because this knight can sometimes get trapped, and for some reason when I was analyzing these lines, I wasn't 100% sure about these positions. Of course, I feel like black should be 100% fine. He's playing a French defense with his horrible bishop on c8, which is usually locked in. It's been traded off, so of course black should be fine. But I really like this move, knight to g8. It's a very, very strange looking move. Doesn't look like it makes much sense, to be honest. But the whole idea is, instead of putting this knight in e4 where it could potentially get trapped, we're going to hop this guy to f5 or c6, put pressure on the white center, and since the position is so closed, I mean, look at the center, it's completely locked. I don't feel like wasting time like this is really such a bad idea. I feel like if white can't checkmate my king before I complete my development, my position is going to be very, very good. And indeed, as we take a closer look into these positions, white cannot checkmate the black king, so black should have a good position. So knight c3 is most natural, and here we play knight to e7. We're not afraid of knight to b5, we'll just play knight c6, and now knight d6 check would be met by bishop takes d6. So, knight to e7, here bishop g5 is a tricky move. So if you play h6, you might run into the very nasty surprise knight to b5. This loses immediately, actually, for black, so don't play h6. Always be on your toes, play the move pawn to a6 instead, preventing knight to b5. And here, let's say rook c1 is played, we'll play h6, and after bishop e3, either knight f5, knight c6, or knight b6, rerouting this knight to c4. Everything is okay here for black. He'll complete his development, get this bishop out, either to e7 or b4, and then castle. 100% no problems, black has a very good position here. And also important to note is after bishop h4, g5 is really, really strong. After bishop g3, this bishop is awfully placed on g3. It does absolutely nothing. It's just biting into its pawn on e5. Black, I believe, is already close to being better. After, let's say, knight to b6, we're going to start playing on the queen side and the king side. And as we know, the center is completely closed, so it's important to understand that my king on e8, even though it's in the center, and I know it feels uncomfortable to have your king in the center like this, there's really nothing to worry about. The king is 100% safe, and white center is going to come under some pressure, and of course we have to remember that his bishop on g3 is really a terrible, terrible piece. It's just like a tall pawn. It really does absolutely nothing. So, to conclude this video, I feel like I've presented some very interesting ideas after bishop takes d7, knight takes d7. And, for instance, let's just recap them. First of all, we play rook to c8. Why do we do this? As we discussed, white has two possible setups. He can play either c3 or b3. So, and against both those setups, the rook on c8 is a very useful piece. So before we commit to playing g6, bishop g7, or e6, we're going to wait a little bit and see what white decides to do. And if he plays, let's say, b3, we play g6, and this bishop, as we mentioned, will be very strong in this long diagonal. And after c3, we play e6. Switching gears a little bit, and we're going to play pawn to d5 after d4. So I think I've offered a very sharp repertoire, very strategic as well. So if you understand this position and your opponent doesn't, it's a sharp position, so you can definitely win a lot of games just by knowing more than your opponent does. And I love this opening a lot. I've had very good success with it, and I think that you will too. Hello everybody, so let's take a look at the open Sicilian, which is really why all the Sicilian players play the Sicilian. These positions are really, really fun to play, and I love seeing the Najdorf appear on the board. So, first we're going to start with the Scheveningen. So basically, against all white lines, I'm going to recommend putting the pawn on e6. I feel like these fluid pawn structures, because you can either play e5 after that in the future if the situation becomes more favorable, or we can play d5. And I really like these fluid pawn structures. They leave a lot of tension in the position, and if black knows when to strike in the center, he can often simply have a better position right away. So I really, and putting the pawn on e6 is called the Scheveningen. the Scheveningen structures, and really another benefit of this is it works against a lot of different white openings. For instance, if white plays bishop e2, we play e6, Scheveningen, bishop e3, we can get the Scheveningen set up. After pawn to a4, get the Scheveningen set up. So this setup crops up very, very frequently, and I think it's really critical for any player, even if they don't play the Najdorf, to be familiar with the Scheveningen setup, because it can come from different openings. For instance, in the classical, you can get a Scheveningen, and of course there's the straight Scheveningen, e6. This is a Scheveningen position. It just crops up so often that I feel like you really should know it. You should know and understand these positions by heart. So we can look at it through the bishop e2 move order. Really, it doesn't matter if it occurs with bishop e3 first or with a4 first. It's really not important. Same position is reached regardless. So we'll play bishop e7 castles. So this is the whole idea of white. He's going to play f castle and then quick central control with f4. So we castle. And now white can play either with a4 or without a4. So let's start by looking at how white can play without committing to the move pawn to a4. So after f4, we play the move knight to c6, challenging the center, developing our pieces. And a common Scheveningen idea is to play knight takes d4, and after white recaptures, to play the move pawn to b5, bishop b7, and get quick pressure on the e4 pawn. And if white tries to avoid that by playing knight to b3, we simply play b6, bishop b7, and start harassing this pawn on e4. And it's important to know if white gets a little feisty and plays a move g4, this is almost never a good idea so early on in the game. I'm just going to simply take and then hit you with e5, and we notice that white has horribly weakened his king, and the center is opening up, and this is not going to be good news for him at all. So here, white can play the move queen to e1, which has become popular, or he can delay queen e1 by playing king h1 first. So we'll take a look at both of those. After queen e1, we continue with our plan of knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then pawn to b5. And now b4 is threatened, and that's going to be pretty uncomfortable for white to deal with. For instance, after queen g3, b4, even though we're not going to be able to win this pawn because of checkmate on g7, this knight on c3 has nowhere good to go. So this is really not what white wants. So white will play a3 to prevent that. We'll play bishop b7, queen to g3. And here an important move is pawn to g6. This is something that you should know. Simply renewing the threat on e4. And white doesn't really have a good way of dealing with this threat. For instance, after bishop f3, very strong is a move pawn to a5, renewing the threat of pawn to b4. This is a very important idea. And after knight takes b5, of course, this guy on e4 is hanging, so we can capture it. So we don't lose a pawn. So bishop f3 is very strongly met by this idea pawn to a5. And after bishop to d, we can follow up with the same idea of pawn to a5. And if knight takes b5, we take queen e3, and here I quite like to move pawn to f5. In reality, it looks like there are weaknesses around the black king, but I'm just going to play bishop f6 at some point, stop any pressure around my king, and I have phenomenal central control with this beautiful knight on e4, beautiful central control right here. Black should have absolutely no problems. So I quite like this idea of playing g6, threatening the e4 pawn, and then immediately following that up with a5. So if white tries to get a little clever and play king h1 before playing queen e1, the idea is after queen c7, which is the normal move, queen e1, in some positions having the king on h1 is more useful than having the queen on c7. So understanding that, instead of playing queen c7, I'm actually going to suggest the offbeat move bishop to d7, which is also how we're going to meet the main line of pawn to a4. We're going to play bishop to d7. And this is it's an offbeat line, it's very rare, and in fact I think it's just as viable as the more popular options, and I quite like it a lot. I've had excellent results with this rare move, bishop to g7. I've even surprised grandmasters with it, gotten very good positions out of the opening. So, if even grandmasters aren't familiar with what to do after bishop to d7, I doubt that most players will be. So let's take a look at what happens after king h1, bishop to d7. So if white continues with his plan of queen e1, we play pawn to b5, and after a3, we play the very clever move queen to b8. So why does the queen come to b8 instead of the more normal square c7? Well, what we want to do is we want to prepare both e5 and b4. So it's very good to have both those options in. And of course, the queen on b8, lovely, helps us do both. So white can try several different moves here. I think black has absolutely no problems. For instance, after bishop to f3, here we chomp on d4, takes, and we play e5. So of course we see the benefit of having the queen on b8. And after bishop e3, bishop to c6. In these positions, it's important to know that after f5, this is usually never anything to worry about because black will always be able to get the move pawn to d5 in. So if f5, I think this is just a very poor decision from white. We'll play queen b7, shove d5, and we'll see that white's pawn on f5 will not stand. He will not get any attack with g4, g5, and black is simply better in my opinion. So yeah, here having the queen on b8 we see is very, very useful because we got e5 in, and black is 100% okay. If queen g3 instead, we see the other idea of, instead of bishop f3, we see the other idea of queen b8. We played b4 here. And I recently actually reached this position against Irene Sukandar, a strong international master from Asia, and I won a very, very nice game after queen takes b4. Simply put, white's attack is not strong at all. There's no real way to get at the black king. It's so solid. You see how this great central control that we've gotten from playing the Najdorf and solid king position really helps prevent white from getting any sort of initiative. And here we see that my attack on the queen side on all of these, and in the center on all white's pieces, is really starting to prove a bit problematic for white. And in these positions, white has no real way of getting an advantage. So, that's what to do after king h1, which has recently become pretty popular. So it pays to know this very rare move, bishop to d7. And indeed, some strong young players, such as Duda, who was the youngest grandmaster in the world at one point, have followed suit. They've played bishop d7, and after queen e1, b5, a3, they've played the move queen b8, and they get good positions. I think this is a great way for black to combat the move king to h1. So let's take a look at the main line, the traditional line, pawn to a4, preventing pawn to b5. So here, again, as we mentioned, I'm going to recommend the very offbeat move, bishop to d7, but also I think equally as viable as the main line, queen to c7. So, bishop to d7. The idea is here we're threatening to play knight takes d4, bishop to c6, which is similar to how in this position we were threatening knight takes d4, b5, bishop b7. Same idea, we want to activate our bishop and attack the e4 pawn. So here white has several different options. For instance, he can play the move, let's say bishop to f3, and here after bishop f3 we can simply play rook e8. There's no need to rush. We're threatening the move pawn to e5, and we see the move pawn to a4 that potentially allowed our knight to hop into b4, which will support the d5 break. Let me change the colors of the arrow to make the plans a little more clear. This pawn in a4 really is proving to be a concession at this point. So after rook e8, of course we can play e5 immediately. That's also possible, but I feel like since white can't really prevent e5, why don't I improve my position before I open up the center? Always a good idea to do that. And like, let's say after queen d2, we play e5, knight e2, and takes. So this is a very common Scheveningen idea, to play e5 and then occupy the center with knight to e5. So a lot of times this can be reached after an exchange on d4. For instance, in this position I don't believe it's good, but we can just just to show you a traditional idea, we can get a position like this. I believe white can take a pawn here. But just to illustrate the idea, we can reach a position like this, and the whole idea is black is going to control the center with the dark squares. Even bishop f6, bishop e5 is also possible in some positions. The whole idea is this pawn on e4 has to be blockaded, and since there are no pawns on either file around it, this e5 square becomes very, very desirable. So this is just a traditional Scheveningen idea that you should definitely file away. You should definitely know about it. And here, of course, I think e5 is stronger, so I'm going to recommend e5. But just as an illustration of some traditional Scheveningen ideas, this sort of structure with e5 is often reached after an exchange on d4. So, I mean, bishop f3, if knight b3, which is, I believe, the most popular move, just avoiding any exchange on d4, here I quite like the extremely rare move, I believe it's a novelty, pawn to e5. And the point is, if f5, we're going to play knight b4, and the whole idea is d5 is coming, and d5 simply cannot be prevented. So, if knight d2 instead, trying to reroute this knight to c4, this, of course, cannot be good for white. It's just so slow. White is spending way too much time. I'm just going to take, rook takes f4, and then, let's say we play bishop e6, let's say knight c4, and, of course, our knight comes to e5. This is everything a Scheveningen player would want. Beautiful knight in the center. This bishop, after this knight moves, will be able to come to f6. The rook is potentially coming to c8. And if knight b6, we simply hop this guy over. And it's important to know that we're perfectly okay giving up our bishop for this knight. Like, these sort of structures are always good for black, because this knight is so strong. This bishop is very, very strong on f6. And another benefit is this d6 pawn is never a weakness, because there's no good way for white to attack it. And these sort of Scheveningen positions are the dream of any player who plays this way. And black just has excellent central control, very, very strong pieces, and white's bishop pair really isn't so scary because this bishop on e2 is simply such a poor piece. So yeah, these Scheveningen ideas are very, very important to know, because a lot of players who don't have a lot of experience will be maybe wary of giving up your light squared bishop, especially since you're aware that this bishop on e7 is technically your bad bishop. But as we see, if this bishop can find its way to f6, suddenly it becomes a very, very powerful piece. And I've actually won a lot of games just by, in the Sicilian, not tactically and not in beautiful combinations or beautiful attacks on the black king, just by understanding that that these structures, after exchanging everything on d5 in the Scheveningen, are often very good for black. So this is definitely something you should file away in your memory, along with, of course, the very traditional e5 break. So yeah, knight b3, e5 is a very nice novelty, and after f5, knight b4, there's a little more analysis here, but I think that black really has nothing to worry about. We play bishop c6, bishop f3, and after d5, really, I believe that black's position is close to being better. I see absolutely no reason for black to be worried about white's kingside attack, simply because the center is getting blown up, and as we all know, we want to meet attack on the flank with an attack in the center, and that's exactly what we're doing. And again, I'm really, really happy with the work I've done in this variation, and I think that black has absolutely nothing to fear. So that wraps up our analysis of the Scheveningen. I think that if you get this sort of position against an opponent who isn't familiar with all of white's plans and all of black's plans, you can get a very good position with black and very quickly, especially since I'm suggesting the very rare move, bishop to d7. So your opponent will not be prepared for that, and if you take a good look at this video and the accompanying file, and you really know what you're doing, I think that you'll have very good results against the Scheveningen. Hello everybody, so now we're going to take a look at the Najdorf-Sozin variation. So the Sozin was a favorite opening of famed American player, not bishop c4 there, knight c3, bishop c4 here, characterizes the Sozin. Famed favorite opening of Bobby Fischer. He had great results with it. But I think that the reason he had such great results with it was because black players simply weren't familiar with the correct way of handling this position. So, here, e6 is really the only move. After e5, of course, you don't want to give white this sort of control over the center like this. So e6 is the only way of playing. And now white can either play bishop to b3, or you can play castles. So after castles, bishop e7 is the best move. And the point is, usually bishop e7 isn't so great because you can't always castle because white can get a quick attack with g4, g5. However, once white has committed his king to the king side, here it makes a lot of sense to simply play bishop e7 and castle. And black has absolutely no problems here. And you're threatening b5 now to chase this bishop away. Queen f3 is maybe a way to try to take advantage of not having wasted a move with bishop to b3, but in reality there are absolutely no problems after castles. Queen g3, and here you can even play the move king to g8, king to h8, just avoiding any bishop h6 nonsense. Of course, b5 is also possible, and black has absolutely no problems here as well. So castles is not very popular for this reason, because of bishop e7 and castles right away. So most players play bishop to b3. And after bishop to b3, b5 is the main move. And here, white can play either bishop g5 or he can castle. So castling, I don't think is as critical. Is as critical because black can continue with the same plan of playing bishop e7 and castling. So let's take a look at bishop g5. Here we play bishop e7, queen to f3. And it's important to note that knight d7 is often a bad idea because of bishop takes e6. So you do have to be careful in these positions. The bishop on b3 is a pretty strong attacking piece. So knight d7 is a bad move. Instead, we're going to play queen to c7. So now e5 is met by bishop to b7. Excuse me. So queen to c7. Excuse me. And after castles queenside, now we can play knight to d7 because white's little swashbuckling idea of playing bishop takes e6 is strongly met by knight to e5. So instead of bishop takes e6, white can try to move pawn to e5. But in general, in these positions, after bishop b7 and then taking on e5, excuse me, not queen h3, queen to g3. My apologies. Knight takes e5. White can try sacrificing on e6, but in general, you should know that there are absolutely no problems here after queen to c8. Knight is in fact in a little bit of trouble. Black's king is very safe because even though there are no pawns in front of it, look at all the pieces around it. This queen can come into the defense. This rook can come into the defense of the black king. White does not have enough firepower to try to checkmate black. So you can take a look at these variations a little more in depth in the PGN file. Everything there is covered. I think just the important thing to know is to know the distinction between playing bishop b3 and the distinction between white castling immediately. So that's important to know why you can play bishop e7 there. And here, of course, you should know that always sacrifices coming on e6. So watch out for those, and if you're tactically alert, you should have nothing to fear. So after castles, which is the main line, here black will play bishop e7, as mentioned before, queen f3, and now I quite like the move queen to b6. So instead of putting the bishop on b7, we're going to put the queen on b7 just so this bishop can keep an eye on this e6 pawn, and also the queen is well placed on b7, attacking e4 and preparing queenside expansion, which is really where black is going to be playing. So queen b6, bishop e3, most natural move. We play queen b7, queen g3, and then we castle. So now e4 is threatened. For f3, we're just going to play bishop to d7. And let me just give you a sample line to show black's general plans. Rook d1, knight c6. Just developing your knight. Very traditional. And if takes, let's say knight e2, so this knight is going to reroute itself to d4. We just play a5. And I think it's clear to see that black is getting very good counterplay on the queen side, and white's attack on the king side really isn't so dangerous. If bishop h6, very simple, knight to e8 will solve most of black's problems. So, in my opinion, the Sozin isn't really anything too scary. I'm always not very threatened when someone plays a Sozin against me, and I think you should feel the same way. Black has learned a lot since the 1970s and 1960s when Fischer was checkmating everybody with bishop to c4. So I think that this is really no longer a super critical test. Hello everybody, so now we're going to take a look at the bishop g5 Najdorf, which in my opinion is the scariest test for black. And also it's becoming very popular, especially because Nagy, one of the best grandmasters in the world, recently released a book, an opening repertoire for white, that recommended the move bishop to g5. He did a very, very comprehensive analysis on it. It was very convincing, and I'm sure a lot of players have read that book and are picking up bishop g5. So against knight to d7, which is the move I'm recommending, Nagy thought that queen e2 gave white an advantage. I found some holes in his preparation, and we'll go over those, and I believe that black is perfectly fine here. That'll be the next video. As for now, we're going to focus on the two moves that were previously considered the main line, 7 f4 and 7 bishop c4. Bishop c4 is technically the most popular move in the database, but I believe that after queen to a5, black has absolutely no problems, and there's a reason why people have stopped playing this way. Bishop c4 is no longer a common move, but it pays to know what to do. After queen d2, we can now play e6, and the point of queen a5 is clear. Now bishop takes e6 is really quite silly because there is no queen on c7 or d8 to be attacked by this knight, so the sacrifice really doesn't make any sense. So white can castle kingside here, but this really is not threatening at all. After b5, bishop b7, the knight will come to c5. Black will play bishop e7, and with the king on g1, there's really no way for white to create a very powerful kingside attack without weakening his own king in the process. So castles queenside is the critical test, and here black can play the strong move b5, and after bishop to d5, a very scary looking move because after e takes d5, e takes d5, the black king is going to get checkmated pretty shortly. We don't play e takes d5, of course. We play pawn to b4. So we're following the game between Anish Giri and the late Vugar Gashimov. And Gashimov won a very nice game with the black pieces in this variation. After bishop takes a8, b takes c3, b takes c3, queen takes a2. You can take a look at the PGN file that will accompany these videos for more analysis on this position. But I think it's clear to see that black has full compensation here. He has, this queen on a2 and this king on c1, in fact, threatening checkmate in one move. The white bishop on a8, I'm not entirely sure how it's supposed to get back into the game. And of course, there are these awful weakened pawns on c3 and c2. Black has a great position here. And indeed, Gashimov won pretty shortly after this in crushing fashion. So I think that this game pretty much put an end to the discussion about this line. I don't think anyone has really tried to play this way since then. So let's take a look at f4, which superseded bishop c4 as the main line in recent years. And here I'm recommending the very rare move pawn to g6. And the reason this move is so rare is because when you turn on the computer engine, it just screams that after queen e2, black is just much, much worse, maybe even losing. And this assessment is incorrect. In fact, after queen to e2, I believe that white is the one who has to be careful to equalize. So after bishop g7, e5, this is really the reason the computer gets so excited. Here it's very important to play the move castles kingside. So the point is, after e takes f6, we attack both the bishop and threaten rook to e8. So we're not losing a piece, and here, in fact, white is just worse. There's no way to keep the queen and the dark square bishop. So white will castle queenside, and here we take on e5, takes, and we play another nice in-between move, queen to a5. So Here, e5 is threatened, and the only way to protect that is knight to f3. And now we play the nice move, knight to g4. And these lines get very, very wild. I'm going to show you a few sample lines. We're going to look at a few of them just so you can get a slightly better feel of the position. The point is basically that, according to computer analysis, black has absolutely no problems here. And in fact, a lot of your opponents might just stop here and see the computer is spitting out some huge numbers for white and just assume that white is just much better, but this is in fact incorrect. White has to be extremely careful to equalize. I think I only found one way, and that is after bishop takes e7, which is a strange looking move to me because this just helps helps black develop. My rook is bearing down on your queen, and I don't really understand why you've done this. The point, I believe, is rook d5, b5, and then this very crazy move, e6. So if your opponent knows this, if your opponent finds this over the board, you have to congratulate him, because even with the computer, I couldn't believe that this was okay. So after knight df6, I believe the position will eventually fizzle out to equality. So we can take a look at that in the PGN file that will accompany the video. The moral of the story is basically the computer is wrong about this position, at least at first. And I think a very natural way to try to punish black is rook d5 instead of bishop takes e7. But this, I think, leads to some problems for black. After b5, white can try h3, knight h6, and then a very natural move g4 to try to prevent knight f5. And here it looks like, black's pieces are really silly. Like my knight h6, what is that doing? My knight d7 is not really going anywhere. My queen on f5 prevents me from playing b4 because it's pinned. Like, my pieces don't look very coordinated. The problem for white is after knight b6, suddenly it's really difficult for white to prevent b4, and white's pieces are actually not as well coordinated as they appear. So after rook d4, let's say, b4, knight e4, queen takes a2, white can try to win a piece with with queen to e3, threatening this knight on h6. But here we see suddenly all the coordination between the black forces. Black simply plays bishop b7, ignoring the threat, takes on h6, and then we simply take on e4. So now queen takes e4 is of course impossible because the bishop takes h6. So rook takes e4, and now we see the coordination of the black forces. Rook to d8, and here I believe that that white is losing, or very close to lost. Rook d4 takes, and now we can simply play check, and then hop this guy over to d8. Black will regain his piece. This king on d2 is not going to be long for this world. So that's just a sample line of the immediate way for white to try to punish you with queen to e2, which is the computer's suggestion. Better is probably queen to f3. And here we play bishop to g7. And white is not playing for e5. Instead, white is just trying to castle and argue that, well, I'm going to still have a good attack against your king because all my pieces are around there. And, this position can get very dangerous. Here I think it's wise to play queen c7 just to avoid castling right away, because if you castle right away, the attack can get pretty nasty. So queen c7, after let's say g4, we'll play h6, bishop h4, and now we can play b5. You can take a closer look at this position in the accompanying PGN file. Pretty much the moral of the story is we'll play bishop b7, knight b6, b4, knight c4, rook c8, like normal Sicilian moves like this. And the idea is the black king is really not in so much danger in the center at the moment. I don't really see a way for white to try to break through and, checkmate black. So that wraps up our sort of video on the sidelines of bishop g5, of f4 and bishop c4, even though technically these moves are more popular than this new idea queen to e2. But I've been to tournaments, I've seen the games of my students, and a lot of people are playing this queen e2 move now because of this book by Negi. So I think this is basically becoming the new main line, and that's going to be the topic of our. As promised, we're going to take a look now at 7 queen to e2, which is the suggestion of Negi in his book about the bishop g5 Najdorf. And this line is very, very scary. And Negi presented a very convincing case for white just being better. However, I found some new ideas that I believe refute some of the suggestions of Negi. So after h6, I think h6 is the best move. Bishop h4, and now we play pawn to g6. Similar to our line against f4. However, the idea is completely different. Instead of playing for bishop g7, we're actually going to play for the move pawn to e5. This is the correct way of playing, and we play g6 to prevent knight to f5. And the argument is, the argument for playing this way is, white's pieces are really quite silly to, deal with the pawn coming to e5. The king will come to g7 after bishop e7. It'll migrate its way over to g7, where it'll be quite safe. And this bishop on h4 is looking quite silly, just attacking this knight on f6 and not doing much else. This queen on e2 is quite silly, preventing any development of the bishop. And the reason we can justify such a waste of time with g6 is the bad positioning of the white pieces. So g6, here f4 is pretty much the only move. In a recent game in the Olympiad, a grandmaster from Norway castled queenside against Sam Shankland of America and quickly got steamrolled after e5, bishop e7. He played f3, and after king f8, the king came to g7, b5 came, and Sam Shankland quickly checkmated the unsuspecting soul from Norway, and it was a very brutal game. So f4 is really needed, because after castles e5, f4 is simply impossible now. So f4, and we meet f4 with e5. So now there are two ways to play this position. White can play knight to f3, or white can capture on e5, and then put his knight on b3. So let's take a look at knight f3 first. We'll play queen to c7, castles, and then b5. So here, there are several different ways for white to play. If he tries to checkmate you with g4, just try to shove his pieces forward, you can just play bishop b7 and play in the center. After, let's say, f5, nothing to really worry about. Just play bishop g7. Nothing to fear here. And we'll play b4 at some, We'll play b4 at some point, and there's really absolutely nothing to worry about. G3 is also an interesting try, intending bishop to h3. And here it's important to know we can just put the bishop on g7. We'll castle next. Our king is quite safe on the king side, and we're going to get quick queenside counterplay. So knight to f3 is not the main line. The main line is f takes c5, d takes c5, and then here white can castle because e takes d4 runs into some nasty business after e5. So we simply play queen c7. We ignore the hanging knight, and here knight to b3 is the main line. And after b5, Negi recommended the move knight to d5. The main move before that was queen f3, but it was pretty clear that after bishop g7, bishop d3, castles, black's king is completely safe. There's no real way to open up this sort of very solid structure. And in the meantime, black is getting quick pressure on the center and on the queen side. So that's why Negi recommended the move knight to d5, and this radically changes the pawn structure after takes, and there are lots of new ideas here that you need to be familiar with. So here, bishop d6 is a good move to prevent pawn to d6 yourself, and here Negi recommended the move. Negi recommends a move queen to d2, and here's where I found some holes in this analysis. King f8 is a good move from black. He wants to get his king out of the center and pop it to g7 potentially. And Nagy recommended this move g4, after which he thought the best move for black was king to g7. But here, I looked at this position and I thought, why don't I just play a5? Why am I wasting time on the king side? I'm just going to immediately start attacking the white king. And I think that this pretty much refutes Nagy's concept. After bishop takes to b5, a4, this knight is forced to go to a1. I think it's clear to see that black has full compensation for his pawn. This knight in a1 is a terrible piece. And if he doesn't take this pawn, I'm not really sure how white is preventing the onslaught. For instance, queen e3. Here, a4 is very logical. This knight can drop back to d2. And b4 looks pretty strong. So this attack is starting to look very, very quick for black. Also good is a move knight to b6. There are just so many good options for black here. I think that really Nagy's idea of queen d2 is not threatening at all. So it's very important because a lot of people will follow Nagy's suggestions. They'll play queen d2 here, and you can immediately hit him with some a5, a4 business, and this can get very unpleasant for white very quickly. So instead of queen d2, I think a lot stronger is the move knight to d2, which bishop d6, which is actually the move that I was going to play when I researched this position as white. And this is a very interesting new idea. I think it's very, very poisonous, and it really pays to know what to do. So the idea is white wants to put his knight in e4, which looks a little silly because black is just going to play f5, and, you know, why'd you put your knight there? Well, the point is white wants to play the move g4 and prevent the move and just allow access to the e4 square for his knight. So this is the whole idea of the setup of knight d2. I think that there are a lot of good ways for black to play here, but white can get some pressure in a lot of them. So I think the most accurate way to equalize is to play knight c5 to prevent knight e4, and after, let's say, king to b1, which is the move I wanted as white, we can play f5 and just take it to white. White will sacrifice his pawn, and after h3, we'll play h5. I think that black should be objectively equal here, but of course the position is really, really complicated. Both sides can play for a win here, and this is really what we're looking for when we play the Najdorf, right? We want to get sharp positions that objectively are fine. So this bishop is going to come to f5. Of course, white has some plans of trying to target the weak kingside pawns of black. I think this position is fascinating, and of course it merits more study. You can take a look at the file that accompanies this video. Honestly, you won't reach this position very often because this idea of knight d2 is extremely rare, but I don't want you to get surprised by someone who's done some good preparation, so I want to let you know about this new idea. And I think that now that you're familiar with it, you won't be surprised by it, and once you realize that this position is okay for black, I think there's nothing to be worried about. So that concludes our video on queen to e2, which is Nagy's suggestion. I found some holes in it, and I think that any Nagy monkey who will just spit out all of Nagy's moves is in for a bit of a nasty surprise if they play this against you.